Did you ever need to test your power supply? The best way to do it is to use a power supply unit tester or PSU tester. And these are those 24-pin connectors that'll connect right to the main power. We're going to show exactly how to use this and how to read the results from that tool. Let's get started with that now. Here are some power supply testers, and they go from oldest to newest. And I also have a USB power tester, and we'll show each of these. Let's describe each one real quick. First, we have this old one here, which is an AT 20-pin power supply tester, which you can also use for the 20-pin connector if it's separate from your 24-pin connector, if the 4-pin is separated from it. And you'll see here that we have the plus 12 volt, the negative 12, the negative 5, the plus 5, plus 3.3, the main voltages you want to check. So this is an old school power supply tester, but if you come across some older power supplies, this is a good guy to use. Then we move into the Thermaltake power supply testers, and that's just one manufacturer. That's generally who I use. And here's one that has the 24-pin connector, so that works with ATX power supplies. And then on the other side, you have Molex, and you have a 4-pin for the CPU, and also an old school 4-pin mini connector or Berg connector, which was used by floppy drives. So if you have any of those older devices with Molex or that type of thing, you can test it with this guy. And these lights light up, telling you whether the voltages are good or not. Same type of thing, plus 5, negative 5, plus 12, negative 12, plus 3.3. And also, this one has a plus 5 standby, which is what ATX power supplies use. If you have the computer plugged in and the computer is off, it's still feeding 5 volts for standby. So you can turn the computer on and it'll activate, or it can be woken up on the LAN or that kind of thing. So that's the plus 5 standby voltage. You may or may not see that lit on some power supplies. It depends. But usually you will for ATX. And then the newest one here, this is the Thermaltake Dr. Power 2. Got your 24-pin connector. Works with the latest ATX as of the recording of this video. And then here we have the old school 4-pin Molex, which you might still have. But we also have those 8-pin power rails that you see most commonly now on today's ATX power supplies. And we showed that when we built the AV editor computer. And, you have your red and your black. You might be using these for video and hard drive and so on. Now, these are passive devices. They require no batteries. They use the power flowing through the connection. So the computer has to be on for them to actually work. They operate on the power from the computer once you plug it in. So that's nice. They're passive, no batteries required. And finally, we have a USB tester. And this will test the voltage that's coming from your USB port. And it'll display what the voltage is, so you can make sure that it's working properly. And normally you want it to be right around 5 volts. And then you have outputs here. So you can plug in devices and see what they are pulling as far as amps, what their draw is electricity-wise from the USB port. So we'll show that too. And let's show we're basically going to focus on this guy and this guy since they're the latest. So let's get into that now. Okay, so let's test the power supply. And first we're going to test the main 24-pin connector over here. Now there's a couple warnings and notes that we have to talk about before we begin. First, you want to employ anti-static methods, your anti-static strap and mat, and connect to any earth bonding point. Whatever you need to do to ground yourself so that we don't damage any of the equipment in here. And try not to touch any of the components when you're disconnecting cables. That's the best way, to be honest with you. Now, when you're dealing with power, you have to be careful. So first of all, you want everything disconnected, your power connection to the computer. Make sure the kill switch is off if you have one. And always read the manual, RTM, when it comes to these power supply testers, because there's a certain procedure, there's a certain order or sequence to these things. For example, if we want to test this main power connection, we need to disconnect all the other power connections from the power supply except for this main. So you got to do that first. So I've disconnected those, and that means optical drives, hard drives, the CPU, all that stuff, the video card, all has to be disconnected before you use this to test the main power connection. So I've done that. I have the computer disconnected and the kill switch is off, and I'm going to remove the 24-pin connector and plug that into this guy, and we'll do the test. To remove it, remember there's a locking tab on the side, so you have to press that in and then pull up. Make sure you press that locking tab so you don't damage the connector. Okay, so I've pulled that out, and you can see this connector is what we were talking about. This has that separate 4-pin, so you could test the 20-pin if you wanted to separately, but I'm just going to test all 24 pins. So we'll plug that into the connector now. Okay, we make sure that that snaps into place. You want to make sure it's locked so that we can start the test. So I'm going to plug in the computer. I'm plugging in the back now and turn on the kill switch, which is going to supply power. Now remember, these are passive devices. They pull the power from the power supply. That's one of the reasons you want to disconnect everything else before testing this 24-pin. So you get a blue screen, and then we're going to hit the test button. Okay, and we get another blue screen, which is good, unlike Windows, and you get your voltages here. If you see a red background on these types of devices, that's bad. A red background accompanied by beeping means that you either still have things connected to the power supply or something is faulty. In this case, everything is good, and you can see the voltages here. For the 5 volt, it's at 4.9. For the 12 volt, it's at 11.9. For the 3.3 volt, it's at 3.3. And for the others, it's very close as well. Your negative 12 is at negative 11.9. Your 5 volt standby is at 5 volts. So we're in good shape. All the voltages are good here. And so that's what we want. We want that blue screen in order to see if the power supply is okay, if that 24-pin is okay. Standard deviation, for example, anything between 4.8 volts and 5.1 volts or thereabouts is good. Normally you'll be a little bit below, so 4.9 is fine. 3.25 is okay. 11.9 is okay. You want to be very close to that voltage. If one is way off, then you want to make sure the connector is connected properly. And beyond that, it could be that one wire is bad. And we can actually test those wires individually with a multimeter. And we'll show how to do that in next sub-lesson. Now, when you're done with your test of your 24-pin, you want to make sure you cut the power. So I've hit the kill switch and disconnect the power cable. And you see the power went out, and that took about 4 or 5 seconds. So you got to wait a little bit. Then we can disconnect this guy and plug him back into the 24-pin and then power up our computer normally. However, I'm going to move on to testing other ports. We're going to test the Molex and also test the 6-pin connector and show how that works on here as well. So we need to leave the 24-pin connector in there to supply power to the power supply tester to test those other cables. So at this point, I'm going to connect a couple cables. I'm going to connect a 6-pin, which will simulate the video power connection. And you can do 8-pin also on this tester. And I'm also going to connect another 6-pin power connector to test for Molex. Okay, so I've made my first connection, and that's the PCI Express video connection. Now, another word of note here, when you're dealing with these testing devices, you can only test one connection at a time, and nothing else can be connected to the power supply. The only thing that could be coming out of the power supply is obviously the 24-pin connector and the individual connector that you want to test. In addition, when we're testing the video, normally that's a red port on the power supply, as we've shown previously. And if you have one of these 6-pin or 8-pin connectors, you want to connect the red side to that power supply port, to that red port, and connect the black side here if it is black. So now that we have that done, we'll hit the kill switch and run the test. The first test here is for the power supply for the 24-pin connection. Press the button again. And there's our PCI connection. And it shows it right at 12 volts, 11.9. And that's what it's supposed to be. That's a 12-volt connector for PCI. So we're all good with that. And I'll kill the power. And we'll disconnect this guy. And we'll connect a Molex to it. Okay, so now I've connected a Molex connector here, and the other end is going to the power supply, and that's just connecting to one of the 6-pin black ports. And so we'll do that test now, make sure it's connected securely. We'll turn on the kill switch, run the test, and that's the main power supply. Run the test again, and there's our Molex connector. And you can see here it says MOX. You know which test you're doing. PCI means the video. MOX is a Molex connector, and so on. You can test all these things. You have the 5-volt connector at 4.9 and the 12-volt wire running at 11.9. So we're within tolerance. Everything is good. One thing to make note of with these tests is these testers do not do load testing. They're just checking the voltage, which gives you an indicator of whether or not the connection works, or if a single wire is bad, or what have you. So they are not load testers, though. If you want to do a load test, that's a completely different thing altogether. Generally, you're not going to have to do that or know that for the A+ exams. So having a power supply tester like this is okay. But keep in mind, when you're using any of these power testers, make sure that you're testing one connection at a time, and make sure you only have one item connected to the power supply. That single item that you're testing, whether it's the 24-pin connector or an individual connector like a PCI or an SATA connection for power or a Molex connector. Make sure that you have the computer turned off, the kill switch engaged in the off position, and have it disconnected as well. And of course, anti-static methods, all that stuff. Make sure you keep this in mind. And probably most importantly, read the manual whenever you're dealing with any types of power devices. Very important that you understand what you're doing before you attempt the test. And one last note, be careful when you're dealing with these guys. These corners could be really sharp, and I've cut myself on these in the past. So, you want to be real careful with these corners, especially on the 24-pin connectors, and also those 6 and 8-pin connectors, especially if they're brand new. They could be super sharp. So be careful with that. And that's about it for the power supply portion of this. Now we're going to get into the USB testing. Okay, so here we have a USB tester, and I've plugged it into one of the USB ports here. You can test any of these ports if you want. And so what we're going to do is we're going to turn on the computer. And when we do so, the output shows at 4.97, 4.96, so it's right at around 5 volts, and that's what we want. Now, if you want to check any of these ports, you can, but generally they're all going to be right around 5 volts for most devices. So this is a handy tool to tell you if a USB port has failed or not, because individual ports can fail. It is possible. You can also check the amps that are being pulled from the outputs from a USB device. And so we'll do that as well. Now, whenever you change any connections, turn off the power. So we'll kill that power now. Wait for that to shut off. And first we'll use just a basic mouse, just to show what that'll pull. I'll connect that guy now. And we'll hit the power again. Okay. And you can see it's at about 5 volts. And you can see the draw from a USB mouse is basically 0. Now, if we were to do something that drew more power, you'd actually see something as far as the amps go. So now we'll just connect a smartphone and plug that smartphone in with the micro USB. Connect the other end to our tester and start up the system. Okay. And now you can see again, we're pushing 5 volts. It's actually a little bit lower now because there is a little bit of a draw. And it's about 0.3, 0.4 amps from that smartphone. So it can charge the smartphone. And that's really all you're going to get from a computer, somewhere in that range, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4 amps. If you want to charge a phone faster and get more power, you want to plug it into the AC charger, especially if you want to do your adaptive charging, your fast charging, that kind of thing. That'll increase the amps and then force the phone to charge faster. As it stands with the USB connection, it'll charge pretty slow. But you can see the power draw is very low for most devices, but it gets higher as you use devices that have, say, moving parts, maybe a webcam, something that does recording. Then your draw gets higher there. So a little USB testing. And again, you can test devices, see what the draw is, and then also test each of your USB ports just in case you think one is faulty. And so that's about it for this sub lesson.